Please give a warm Georgia Tech welcome to our best for last guest, Dr. Bob Pozen.
Well, thank you for that very lovely introduction. You left out my high school basketball career, though. And probably because it was very short-lived. But I wanted to say that, you know, the reason I'm here is I worked for quite a few years with the elder Tom Williams. He was a trustee of the Fidelity funds when I was president, and we grew those funds from about 200 billion to $1 trillion, and he was really a great trustee, very smart guy, very tough questioner, and a guy of huge integrity, and also a really supportive person. So it's rare that you see a person with all those characteristics, and I'm very happy to be giving this lecture in his honor, and glad to see his son here. I was thinking about what I should talk about, and I thought this is a subject that is sort of below the radar screen, and it might be really of interest to you. So think about this. Detroit went into bankruptcy. We all know that. Its unfunded pension liabilities were about $3.5 billion. But its unfunded retiree health care was $6 billion. So everyone knows a lot about the pension crisis that we're having in lots of states and lots of cities, but really there's a very significant crisis in most cities and most states, including Georgia, on retiree health care. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, and I'll leave plenty of time for questions. And quite frankly, I'm used to the Socratic method. So if anybody has any questions or comments in the middle, just raise your hand. We can debate it. So please, I love questions. I love interaction. So let's see. Let's start. I can see if I can do this. Not a good start. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so what are we going to cover today? We're going to first understand defining what the problem is and the accounting rules, which are very important in this area. Then we're going to look at some numbers in terms of the problems in various states and cities, including Atlanta and Georgia. We're going to compare retiree health care issues to pension issues. And then I'm going to give you some of my ideas about possible changes, and going to talk about the relationship to the ACA, better known as Obamacare. So, I think I ought to get one of these. So let's begin with the question of what are these? They're often called other post-employment benefits, OPEBs, O-P-E-B, just another acronym. But what they really are when public employees retire, and many of them can retire after 20 or 25 years, so they're retiring at 45 or 50. In most states and most cities, the public employees are promised virtually free health care until Medicare, until 65. And so usually the state or city pays 80 to 90% of the premiums of these people who are retired. And sometimes even in Medicare, they continue to get retiree health care benefits. And this is a very substantial number, as we'll see. So these are people who are getting essentially free retiree health care from, say, age 50 to 65, and then they're getting subsidized even when they're in Medicare, because part of Medicare, you do pay some premiums. So when you see this phrase OPEB, 99% of OPEBs are retiree health care. So there are a few other things stuffed in it, but they're not very important. Now, did I get that? Nope. So one of the questions you might ask is, how is it, yes?
Okay, well, I am a retired retiree, Georgia Tech Class of '83. I retired last year. And I essentially saved 10% of my money through my employee stock options and my 401ks. So I saved like 10%, but most of my companies had matched up to 6%. So I was actually saving like 16%, or like between 14 and 16%. And I have.
Excuse me, you going to ask a question?
I'm just setting the stage because I think a lot of what's going on with this is the same impacts that those of us who are retiring at 50 to 60 are encountering, even if we had a corporate career. Because most of the corporations are not paying any subsidies anymore either. They're not paying pensions and they're not paying subsidies.
Okay, well, I still haven't heard the question, but you're right to say that most corporations had retiree health care and they're no longer paying it.
Right.
But in the public sphere, states and cities, 80 to 90% of states and cities are still paying retiree health care.
Well, I understand.
And it's being negotiated and being modified, and there's a big debate about it.
Well,
but most are still paying.
The question is, since the corporations have been gotten out of this business, are you going to address what the public sector needs to do to get out of the business as well?
Yes, I'm going to address that in my proposals at the end. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll be there.
All right.
I'll come back to you. Okay, so one question you might ask is, except for this lady, how did these large numbers occur without your knowing it? And the answer is bad accounting. Until 2006, cities and states were not required to disclose what they had promised in terms of retiree health care. So just think about it. If you're a city council member, there's a negotiation, it's so much easier to promise health care in 20 years than to give a wage increase now, because it's below the radar screen. If you give wages, wage increase, it's in the top of the newspaper. If it's not in your financial statement, nobody knows about it. So this occurred below the radar screen for many years. Now, in 2006, there's a board. It's called the GASPE. It's the Government Accounting Standard Boards, which sets the accounting standards for government entities. You may have heard of FASB, the Financial Accounting Standard Board. How many people heard of FASB in this room? Okay, well, this is the government equivalent of it, but it doesn't have the power that FASB have, because FASB derives its power from the SEC, which essentially says if you don't follow FASB, you can't put your financial statements into registration statements and prospectuses. So GASB started by asking for footnotes, and they wanted to have some footnote disclosure, and currently these liabilities are not on the balance sheet. And most importantly, as we'll see, there is no requirement for advance funding. These are pay-as-you-go liabilities. Now, right now, we are having a debate because GASB has proposed new standards. And if these standards are adopted, which I hope they will be, we'll have a lot more information about these retiree health care obligations. One of the most important questions is, what's the discount rate? How many of you guys deal with discount rates? So, okay. So discount rate, the lower the discount rate, the higher the liability. The higher the discount rate, the lower the liability. So lots of cities and states have played games with the discount rate, and while the discount rate should be representing what you can for certain get on a long-term investment, something like 3 or 4%, most cities and states are using 7 and 8%, and that's much too high. So GASB is saying, let's get a uniform and reasonable discount rate, and that will give us a much better sense of the liabilities here. Remember, discount rate means you project your liabilities over 50, 70 years, whatever it is, and then you discount them back to see what you would have to invest now to for sure get to that number in the future. So I don't know if someone can someone guarantee me 8% here return for the next 40 years? Please raise your hand, I'll take it. So in fact, that's what's happening. The other thing that's being proposed is that these liabilities should be on the balance sheet of every city and state. So not just in these obscure footnotes that a lot of people don't read, but actually on the balance sheet and count as a liability. This will have a big political impact, and I think it's already starting to have an impact in the rating agencies who are looking at the bonds of cities and states and thinking about not only the pension liabilities, but the retiree health care. Now, let's look at the scope of the problem just to give you some numbers outside of Georgia, and then we'll look at Georgia. Okay, so here, what's the unfunded OPEB per capita? Here are the highest states. New York, its total OPEB is over 60 billion. New Jersey, over 60 billion. Texas, 55 billion. Illinois, 33 billion. Those are huge numbers. And if you look at it per capita, they're still huge numbers. New Jersey wins. New Jersey has the most unfunded liabilities for retiree health care of any state. Think about that. $7,200 per person in liability. It's a lot. Now, interestingly, there are a number of states that don't have very big liabilities. Here they are. They tend to be in the West. They tend to be in smaller states, states that somehow never got into this routine, and they have very manageable situations. Now, this is a chart that was done by JP Morgan, and they're saying if you were to pre-fund this obligation, what should you be putting into your retiree health care fund every year, and what's actually being put in? And as you can see, in each of these states, what they're putting in is way below what you would need if you wanted to amortize this, if you wanted to actually advance fund this over 30 or 50 or 70 years. So this is a problem that's growing every year because each year the liabilities are growing and each year we're underfunding it. So let's take a look at Georgia. So the total liability in Georgia as a state is $15.4 billion. So I don't know. In Atlanta, it's a very wealthy city, but $15.4 billion is real money. And what's the total advance funding? $818,000. It's trivial. There is no advance funding. And so what's the OPEB per capita in Georgia? 1,474 for every person in Georgia. So it's serious. It's serious. And let's take a look at cities. New York leads the way. New York City has $70 billion in unfunded retiree health care. Think about that. Even in New York City, that's a lot of money. And Boston, where I live, has $4.55 billion. But in Boston, they just reduced the number to $3 billion. You know how they did it? They increased the discount rate. Abracadabra, it went down from $4.5 billion to $3 billion. Atlanta has underfunded liabilities of about $1 billion. And this, again, you get to these numbers here. There is no funding. You know, we think about pension funds, and we say if it only has 60 or 70% funding, it's really not very well funded. Well, these are 0% funded. So that's a pretty low number. And again, we see some cities have done a pretty good job. And again, many of them tend to be the West. But this is not something that you can't do. It's a political issue about whether you're going to do it. I'm going to hold off on your question, okay? So if we think about OPEBs versus pensions, this is an important distinction because in the pension world, it is required under ERISA for companies and under GASPE for cities and states, it is required that there be a separate trust set up and that there be contributions be made with employer and sometimes employee contributions. And pensions, therefore, have a lot of advance funding. The best places have like 90% advance funded, meaning that they don't have to be putting in a lot of money over the next 10, 20, 30 years. The worst placed state is Illinois now, but even that is 50% funded. It's only in this area where we have 0% funding. The other thing about pensions that is really tough is if you try to change a pension scheme, often you will find that the state constitution, I don't mean a statute, I mean the constitution of the state, protects and essentially prohibits any reduction in accrued pension benefits. How do I know that? I was the Secretary of Economic Affairs in Massachusetts for several years when we had a budget crisis, and we tried to make a really small change in the way pensions were calculated to reduce the liability, and the court said in Massachusetts, this is constitutionally protected, so you can't change it. That's also true, I was just teaching in California, that's also true in California. In California, in San Jose, they had a referendum, and the public voted to reduce some of these pension costs, not for people who are already retired, but for people coming down the line, and the court said, no, you can't do it. So this is a big problem with pensions, and this is the saving grace of retiree health care. Retiree health care is not protected by constitutions in any state, and it's easier, therefore, to negotiate changes and to sort of slowly manage this down. So, just to give you some detail from Massachusetts, where is this money coming from? And I've tried to think about how can you drive this home to people that this is a problem. When you say to them, well, it's a $2 billion problem or $5 billion problem, I mean, most people, it's too abstract. So what I've been trying to do is translate it into things that really hit home. And one of them is the property tax. How much property tax are you paying? Because that property tax in most cities and counties is the main source of revenue. And if more and more of that has to go to retiree health care, that just means there's less for schools, for police, for parks, for all those things. So here, if you look at 4 cities in Massachusetts, you can see that between 2009 and 2013, there was a substantial increase in the retiree health care liabilities, the most being here, 6, New Bedford, etc. So we see the numbers here, and then we see what the increase in property tax was. And we can see that a large part of the increase in property tax in these cities was being devoted to retiree health care. In the case of Springfield, over 100%. In the case of New Bedford, 51%. So if people start to realize that this is not an abstract issue, but it really impacts their property taxes, I believe they will start to be alert about this and think about what should we do here. And here's another set of numbers. The town of Newton is about 60,000 people. It's a nice suburb of Boston. And they spent $21 million on total retiree health care last year. That represented $747 of each household's annual property tax bill. So this is not a theoretical issue, this is a big issue. In Massachusetts, you're not allowed to increase the property tax beyond a certain level. It's called Proposition 2.5, without a vote of the citizens. And so in Newton, they had a vote and they approved an increase in property tax of $8.4 million. But no one told people that $8 million of that was going to retiree health care. That's why they had to increase the property tax. What does $8.1 million translate into? 79 additional teachers. So this is what I want you to understand, that if we don't deal with this problem, the number will get higher and higher. And this, where are we going to pay for it? Out of tax revenues, out of property tax revenues. But it's going to compete against all the other needs that we think are important. Now, let's think and go to this question of what we could do about this. And so this goes to the point you're making. So one thing you could do is to modify benefits and premium subsidies. So what does that mean? Well, if you look at a lot of these policies, many of them have no co-payments and no deductibles. Now, we know that that incents bad behavior. If we want people to go to doctors when they need it, we need modest co-payments and modest deductibles. Another question is, as new people come in the system, are we going to make as generous promises as we've done for the people who are already retired? And a third question is, what's the scope here? Most company plans now, you have to pay separately for dental and eye care. In many of these states and cities, that's automatically covered. So these are certain things that you could do while continuing to have a reasonable health care package, but it would be a little smaller, a little less costly for the city or the state. Now, another thing is eligibility standards. This is something we've been fighting real hard for in Massachusetts, because in Massachusetts, if you work for a state or city government for 10 years, even part-time, then you're eligible for retiree health care for the rest of your life. Now, that's ridiculous. If we're going to have retiree health care, it should go to the long-term municipal and state employees who have dedicated their life to that. It shouldn't be for people in the short term. And the big question is whether or not the employees should be covered, as well as spouses and children. And lastly, oops, we're really screwing up. Okay, and lastly, the question is, should we end subsidies when people get to Medicare? Most of Medicare is financed by the federal government. There are premiums. It's a progressive premium system. That is, if you make more money, you pay more premiums. So it's unclear why we should have any retiree health care for cities or states once people hit Medicare. Another thing that could be done is changing what are called the COLAs, the cost of living adjustments. Many cities and states provide that as the cost of healthcare goes up, the premium subsidies automatically go up. So this can get pretty costly because healthcare costs have been going up. The good news about that is that there are a number of states that have been revising their COLAs down. Many of them have been challenged in court, but the courts have said it's okay. It's okay going forward, not for people who are retired, but for people who are in the workforce or new workers. Now, this is the most important probably slide, is there was just a Supreme Court case involving a collective bargaining agreement. And the Supreme Court was faced with this situation. If you looked at the contract, like a lot of contracts, it's a negotiated document and isn't totally consistent. Part of the contract said, we promise health care to these people, full health care for their lives. But another part of the contract said, the contract ends in 3 years and has to be renegotiated. So the court said, basically, that you can't look at when you look at the contract and it's inconsistent, you cannot infer what the intent of the parties were. You actually have to present evidence as to what happened at the bargaining table and what actually people meant. And the court established two important presumptive principles. One is that if we're going to award lifetime benefits in healthcare, then it ought to be in the express language of the contract. And that's an important principle. And the second one is generally benefits do not go beyond the end of the contract. That is, when the contract ends, the benefits ends. So what's going to be the result of this is that the combination of the accounting issues becoming on the balance sheet, these numbers on the balance sheet, with this Supreme Court decision, we're going to start to have this all out in the open, on the table. We're going to start to have negotiations about what actually should be in these bargaining contracts going forward. And the good news is that the courts are saying that you can have reasonable changes. The way I look at it is this. Right now, all these unions have unfunded promises. As we saw in Detroit, if the municipality goes bankrupt, there's nothing backing those promises. So there is a compromise to be made where the package of benefits is narrowed and made reasonable, and those are actually pre-funded. That's the sort of deal that you can sort of think of seeing. Now, the last point I want to make here is that in the Affordable Care Act, even in every state, almost every state has an exchange now. Many of them are run by the federal government, some of them are run by the states. There's a lot of Supreme Court, there's a big case in the Supreme Court that will look at this. But I assume that one way or another, there'll continue to be federal premium subsidies. So the question is, if we have retirees get their health care policies through these exchanges, they are then eligible for federal premiums, which means a lot less cost for the state. So this is one I ran for Massachusetts. If you look at exchanges, they have 3 levels of health care policy. The lowest is bronze, the second is silver, and they have gold. So this is a gold policy. This is a very good policy. And if you look at this, it would cost $1,319 per month for a family of 50,000. But the federal government will pay $945 of that if you're in that income group. So merely by taking retirees and saying, gradually you need to move over to these exchanges, states and cities can shift a lot of money and a lot of subsidies to the federal government. Now, I'm not saying that's overall going to reduce healthcare. It isn't. It's cost shifting, but it would make a big difference to lots of cities and states. So what are my conclusions here? The conclusions are that this unfunded liabilities are rising quickly, and they're rising in many cases much faster than unfunded pension liabilities, because pension liabilities have to have a separate trust and be funded. The new accounting rules are going to force this all in the open, and once these unfunded liabilities get on the balance sheet, it's going to make a big difference to the politicians and to the bond rating agencies. But the good news is that these retiree health care promises have less legal guarantees than pensions and are not in Constitution. So this is a subject for collective bargaining. I don't know what the right answer is, but people can negotiate, figure out the costs, and see whether they can do it. So hopefully that's what we're going to have here, is a real vigorous public debate. People are going to see the real numbers and then decide what's a reasonable policy for that city or that state relative to other services that they want to give. So I'm going to stop there and I will take questions. Okay, I'm going to let, before I give you a second question, I want to, yes, sir.
Were you going to make a statement for questions?
Excuse me?
Were you going to make a statement?
No. My statement is just that I want to have, before we have people ask a second question, I want everybody to have
Okay.
ask
Yeah,
the
but my question is about rewarding bad behavior. Take these western states that have done a good job of sort of controlling their unfunded retiree healthcare costs. If indeed you do move the burden from the state to the federal government, all you've done is shifted the tax obligation. And doesn't Does that kind of screw the states that have been doing a
Well,
good job and
you're
reward bad
absolutely
behavior?
right. If you take a state like New York that has run up this big, huge liability, and you allow them to shift half of it to the federal government, that's really rewarding bad behavior and indirectly forcing Montana and Minneapolis to subsidize them. I would agree. So that's a good point. And
Does that make it a good solution or a poor solution?
yeah.
I guess it depends on whether you're in New York or Montana.
I think that's very much true. But it's a good point. I'm soliciting other questions. Yes. Yes.
So is there any work being done parallel to what you're speaking of to reduce the cost of health care overall, hospitalization, prescriptions especially? That would
Well,
help.
there is a whole, this is like a whole separate lecture that could be given on what we're trying to do to reduce healthcare costs. And the answer is we're doing some things, but we could do a lot more. What are we doing? Well, I was involved with the structuring of rehospitalization penalties. What you saw is that some hospitals had 20% of their people coming back within 60 days. Other hospitals had 10%. So there's a huge difference. So now the way the federal government reimburses these hospitals, they get penalized if people come back within 60 days. It turns out the reason why a lot of people come back in 60 days is because they don't have a list of their medication. Or there's a bad handoff from the hospital to the local doctor. This isn't high tech, it's low tech.
And a lot of people are addressing that.
Okay, and there are lots of things that people are doing in terms of trying to create accountable healthcare. There are a lot of things that people are doing, but it's slow, and you're really talking about a major change in culture. Yes?
I want to tell the tale of two companies. I worked for Sprint from 1989 1994, was covered by pension. Then I worked for Nextel from 1997
I hope
till
there's a question
2006.
in here
No,
someplace.
I'm setting the stage. I worked for Nextel from 1997 to 2006. They merged. I wound up with 14 years. I took a package from Nextel in 2006. Got paid for that layoff, 9 months salary, 9 months pension, started working on my own. The Sprint pension was cut off post-merger. So if you had put into the Sprint pension, if you stayed with Sprint Nextel, you got nothing else. Nextel rewarded us with stock options. Stock options also ended. With the layoff, you were allowed 60 days to sell your stock options,
Okay,
and I got
I'm
lucky.
gonna get,
Now, let me
I'm
tell
gonna
you.
get a lot
no,
tougher
no,
with
no,
you.
Let me tell you how this ties into what you're saying.
We gotta
Okay,
get
neither
there.
neither of those included any health care. I'm an ACA. I love it. Now, your party, Republican Party, wants to end my
Okay,
federal
by the
subsidy.
way, I'm not a Republican.
Well,
not
you
I-
worked for
I
them.
am
You
not-
took a paycheck.
I-
You're with them. Okay.
No, I
So
worked
here's
for,
a here's
I
a
worked
deal.
for Mitt Romney in a state where there are basically only Democrats.
Well, true, but they want to dismantle the Romney Care, Obamacare, ACA Act, and that's patently unfair for those of us who are retiring before we can get Medicare. Okay, but ACA turns out to be a blessing because I have Humana Platinum for half what Cobra would have cost me,
Good.
and Cobra was a Republican thing. Okay, so I'm just saying that.
Well, what you're saying is that ACA provides a way for people before 65
Right.
who get laid off or whose corporate employer no longer offers them health care to find a reasonable way to get health care.
The benefit for all of these guys is they're coming out in a new economy and they don't have to make the adjustments I made.
Okay, any other questions that we have? Yes, we have one here and then young Tom.
I wanted to ask you, as an investor in municipal bonds, to you as the former chairman of Fidelity and MSS, these bonds are rated by the agencies, and they carry triple and double and so forth. And you invest in, your funds invested in a lot of tax-free bonds and so forth. How how do we, as investors, on an individual basis, we can go to Emma or somebody and see the financial.
Okay, so the answer is this. At Fidelity, I wasn't chairman, I was vice chairman. Ned Johnson wouldn't like that. He was chairman, but he was a very good chairman. But when we look at a bond at Fidelity or any other good investment, the rating is just the beginning of the analysis. We don't assume that all those ratings are correct. God knows in 2008 we learned that lots of AAA bonds weren't really that sound. So we go behind that to look at what the liabilities are. So there are really two possibilities. One is that you go into a situation where an expert vets this for you. It could be a fund or something else. Or the second is if you're willing to do the research yourself, because now these liabilities will be on the balance sheet. But I can assure you that the rating agencies will start to change their ratings and lower them for cities and states that keep running up these big unfunded liabilities in pensions and healthcare. It's already happened in Illinois, and it's going to happen elsewhere. So hopefully the rating agencies, which are always a step behind, will catch up. But ultimately, and I say this generally, the rating is just the beginning of analysis. You can't rely on them to be the answer.
But one short, quick follow-up question. Based on what you showed, would you invest in New Jersey and New York?
Well, you have to look at New Jersey's situation in the overall context of its revenue. And so I have not studied the overall New Jersey situation, but that surely would be a significant factor. But it's not the whole ballgame. We've got to look at all the factors. Yes?
Bob, if I'm hearing you correctly, there's a market-driven component to uncovering the problem, and there's a public policy, public engagement aspect to the solution. There are a lot of folks that think that all solutions have to be market-driven. Can you talk a little bit more about, with the rating agencies, how you believe that the market's going to make this come to the fore and not just get swept under the rug?
Well, I think what will happen is that the rating agencies, as these liabilities go on the balance sheet, will start to reconsider whether these are really AA or AAA. But I couldn't agree with you more. It needs both. It needs the political process. Once we get these numbers out there, we need to not just have the rating agencies look at them, everybody in Atlanta ought to look at them and think about what sort of liabilities we're building up here. Can we afford them? Is this the right policy for us or not? And I think that has to happen in lots of cities and lots of states. Until that happens, until the politicians feel that they're being held accountable for these promises, and they're not just something that can be below the radar screen, it's going to be hard to get things to change. Other questions?
Yep, we've got one more question.
One more question, and then we'll all go for drinks, right? They're serving beer here, right?
So one of the great employee perks, I worked for the state of Georgia for 11 years, came back to do a PhD, is that you have that net income reduction. You take it out before your taxes for health care. How does that play into some of these shifts?
Well, I think it's a very complicated question, and it differs a lot from state to state. In some states, the employees are making a contribution. In other states, they're not. That's also true of pensions. So you have to look. If the employees are making contributions, well, then they should get benefits that are appropriate for it. I think the more complicated question is, how much of increase in wages did your union give up to get the retiree health care benefits? And that's a complicated question, and people on the union side would argue that they gave up a lot of wages, so in some sense, they're entitled to these retiree health cares. And that's really a hard question, very hard question, because it was all done below the table. Well, I hope all you guys had a good time, and I'll stay around to answer any other questions that people have.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.